Before we dive into the video, I want to give a shout out to this video's sponsor yet again, Surfshark VPN. As I have mentioned before, one of the top issues for people trying to watch a lot of quality samurai films or TV shows is simply streaming services not allowing you to access specific content like that in your region. This is something you can actually get around by having a VPN through Surfshark. A VPN is a virtual private network. Having one is a fantastic way to keep your time on the internet private, safe, and secure. But through Surfshark, you can also use it to change the region in which you are accessing the internet from, making it so that you can watch more of the movies and shows you want, even if they are not available to stream in your country. For all of these reasons, I fully recommend checking out Surfshark, especially because of the amazing offer you can get by using the promo code Shogunate to get 83% off and your first 4 months free as part of Surfshark's Black Friday special, the link to which can be found down in the description. Don't miss out on this great deal on your very own VPN. But with that said, let's get on to the video. This month, on my Patreon poll to determine the next Samurai Clan history video, it was decided that the Ashikaga would be the clan I cover here today. So far, we have covered some very significant clans here on the channel, and although you may not hold the Ashikaga up to the same level of fame as other clans we have covered, like the Oda or Takeda, but I assure you, the Ashikaga fit right up there with some of the most important samurai clans that ever existed. Today, we often only remember them for their faults, their inefficient shoguns and their weak government, all of which leading to their inability to stop the eventual outbreak of the Sengoku Jidai. But let's not forget that for a time, the Ashikaga were strong and had enough power to seize the country and establish their own military government. So, let's dive in and witness the rise and fall of the Ashikaga clan. The origins of the Ashikaga family date all the way back to the Heian period, before the samurai ever rose to power. It was here in likely the 12th century we see Minamoto no Yoshikuni become lord of the Ashikaga fief located in Shimotsuke province. It is said that his descendants would in time come to take the name of this land as the name of their branch of the family. Thus, we see the initial birth of the Ashikaga clan at some point within the 1100s, prior to the Genpei War that would soon erupt in 1180. In the build-up to this great conflict, the Ashikaga would come to play a role in plenty of the major developments of the age, taking part in the Hogen Rebellion on the side of Minamoto no Yoshitomo. But of course later, during the actual Genpei War, they would side with Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had emerged from his exile to challenge the powerful Taira clan. And after 5 brutal years of war, the Minamoto would claim victory, leading to Yoritomo being bestowed with the title of shogun, thus reforging his samurai government in Kamakura into the first shogunate. Through their service in the war and throughout other conflicts, the Ashikaga family had risen to become prominent senior vassals to the shogun. And even after the decline of the Minamoto name, they maintained good relations with the Hojo clan, who had become the main ruling regency of the Kamakura shogunate. In time, they would be awarded the status of Shugo military land governors and would be granted lordship over Mikawa and Kazusa provinces. And from under their reign, we begin to see the origins of some other families that would one day rise to prominence. Families such as the Hosokawa, Imagawa, Shiba, and even the Hatakeyama. But as we know, the Kamakura shogunate would not last forever, and in time they were destined to fall. It was here by the early 1300s we see the rise of one of the most important Ashikaga leaders that everyone should know, Ashikaga Takauji. By 1331, the many mounting weaknesses of the Kamakura shogunate had become overwhelming, made evident by shortcomings following the Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. And now, spurred ever forth by the ambitious Emperor Go-Daigo, who wished to depose the shogun and return to ultimate power. This would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Genko War, when those opposed to the Kamakura shoguns rose up and rallied behind Go-Daigo in aims to topple the shogunate. And although at first the shogunate seemed poised to crush the uprising, there would soon be a great betrayal. Ashikaga Takeuji had been entrusted to lead his forces from Kyoto to finish off the rebellion, yet, for one reason or another, seeing an opportunity present itself, Takeuji switched sides and led his army back against the shogunate in the name of the emperor. With things now caving in for the Kamakura shogunate, they would finally capitulate in 1333. This would lead to the brief Kinmu restoration when Emperor Go-Daigo now held ultimate power across the land. It is believed that Takeuji perhaps sought reward for his service to the emperor, that in the aftermath he would be named the new shogun. However, Go-Daigo was not about any of that. Emperor Go-Daigo was instead bent on dialing back Japanese politics to a time before samurai rule, dismantling the political infrastructure that had been established through the rule of the Kamakura shogunate. Obviously, this was going to anger the samurai class, who felt now as if they were being alienated. A choice was quickly coming to fall upon all samurai. Would they stand loyally by the emperor, or would they instead move to work against him? For Takeuji, it appears he would initially try his best to reason with Go-Daigo in attempts to help him realize that uprooting the established system would only go to antagonize the warrior class. Yet Go-Daigo understood that this was a necessary move, and he was confident with those who already backed him that he would be able to maintain power. Particularly, we see the famous samurai general Kusanagi Masashige. Masashige was a great champion of the emperor and had become one of the primary innovators of samurai guerrilla warfare, as seen during the earlier Genko War. He was bound and determined to serve the emperor no matter what. Eventually, through Go-Daigo's antagonization of the samurai, there would be yet another revolt, this time to overthrow Emperor Go-Daigo. And in time, Takeuji found himself at the head of the movement against the man he had just helped restore to power. Takeuji would initially be pushed back by the imperial loyalists, causing him to then flee to the island of Kyushu, where he would then reconsolidate his forces. Fighting his way back towards the capital, he would engage the imperial army at the historic Battle of Minatogawa, where he would win a monumentous victory, while also slaying the imperial loyalist and soon-to-be martyr, Kusanagi Masashige. By 1336, Takeuji had seized Kyoto and established his military headquarters there, so that he could have better direct control over the flow and influence of imperial politics, with Go-Daigo having fled. Komyo, another member of the imperial family and more loyal to the Ashikaga, would soon be crowned the new emperor. However, Go-Daigo, in opposition to this, established his own imperial court to the south, where then he tried to compete for legitimacy. This is the real beginning of the Nanboku-cho period, where Japan was embattled between those loyal to the separate imperial courts. In 1338, Takeuji, having established his military government in the capital, would soon be bestowed with the title of shogun. Thus began the age of the Ashikaga shogunate. This era would be known as the Muramachi period, named after the later location of the Ashikaga Palace in Kyoto, Hanano-gosho, which was located on the Muramachi street. However, also because of this, the Ashikaga shogunate, or bakufu, often gets labeled as the Muramachi shogunate, or bakufu. It is also important to note that although the main power base of the Ashikaga shogunate was located in Kyoto, they had not forgotten about the importance of the Kanto region, the seat of the previous shogunate. Through the lordship of the Ashikaga Kanto Kubo and his deputy Kanto Kanrei, Ashikaga authority strived to be maintained over the region despite the far distance from the capital. And although we see the rise of some significant Ashikaga figures in this part of the country and politics, I am instead going to continue to focus on the Ashikaga shoguns in Kyoto for this video. Throughout the following years, Ashikaga forces and those loyal to the northern imperial court worked hard to crush the southern court and those loyal to it. Their efforts would even force the southern court to relocate after their original location in Yoshino was overrun. Yet Takeuji would never be able to destroy Go-Daigo's southern court during his lifetime, as an internal conflict known as the Kano disturbance within the Ashikaga family would cause them to not be able to keep up the pressure. It was here that Takeuji's younger brother, Ashikaga Tadayoshi, who had been acting as sort of a vice shogun to Takauji, had a falling out with his brother that boiled over into a full conflict. This would eventually lead to Tadayoshi and his allies all switching sides to support the southern court, empowering it to continue the fight against the northern court for some time. The southern court would even briefly seize Kyoto, capturing the imperial regalia along with 2 of the former emperors themselves before being driven out. Takauji would later die in 1358, passing leadership of the family and the shogunate onto his son Ashikaga Yoshiakira. But among his other inheritance, he had also the hard task of trying to wade through the mess of the situation his father had left for him, with Japan largely disorganized between those loyal to the northern court, southern court, or just using the chaos as an excuse to expand. Because of this, I consider the Nanbokucho period a close parallel to the chaos that would later come during the Sengoku Jidai, but due to the identity of the 2 established factions, we can't necessarily call it as chaotic as the later warring era. But the main takeaway here is that the Ashikaga shogunate had the roughest start of any of Japan's 3 shogunates, as it was established during a time of war and was unable to initially crush its enemies, causing it to have a disjointed and dysfunctional system of governance from the very beginning. The weak grip that the Ashikaga shoguns would continue to have over the nation would allow many clans across the country to continue to grow their increased autonomy, as countless ambitious Shugo military land governors took advantage of the shogunate's feebleness. But not all the Ashikaga shoguns would be weak, as the 3rd shogun of the Ashikaga shogunate, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, would actually come to be one of the most effective shoguns of the era. Under Yoshimitsu's reign, we see order somewhat restored, as uprisings were put down and eventually by 1392, both competing imperial courts were reconciled, as Yoshimitsu was able to negotiate a reasonable outcome for both parties that involved alternating succession to the throne. Thus, Yoshimitsu can be credited with ending the Nanbokucho period of Japanese history, returning Japan to a sense of peace for a time. And although this is largely Yoshimitsu's greatest achievement, we should also not forget that it was under him that we see the Great Golden Pavilion also constructed. Following the death of Yoshimitsu in 1408, we start to see the future generations of the Ashikaga family become less and less effective leaders, as peace in Japan gave way to cultural blossoming across the country, but particularly in Kyoto, where the Ashikaga shoguns began to lose themselves in extravagance, no theater, and poetry. Gradually, their influence over the country declined. In fact, we even see that they were unable to prevent the Korean invasion of Tsushima in 1419. Tsushima had become a den of rampant wako piracy, and even after Korea had petitioned the Ashikaga shogunate to intervene and suppress the pirates, they were unable to. Finally, Korea took matters into their own hands and launched an invasion which seized the island and rooted out the pirate threat before leaving. By 1449, we at last enter into the reign of Ashikaga Yoshimasa, an otherwise unremarkable shogun, were it not for the disastrous war that he would later be partly the cause of. After a series of famine and disasters that had gripped Kyoto, Yoshimasa had lost all interest in leadership, as his only escape was through his life of arts and luxury. Thus, by the early 1460s, he had made it clear that he intended to retire from his position as shogun. But being that he had no heirs to speak of, he would in the end nominate his brother, Yoshimi, who had taken the life of a monk. Surprisingly, however, shortly thereafter, Yoshimasa did give birth to a son, Yoshihisa, who could be a proper heir. Factions who were eager for increased power started to back either his brother Yoshimi or his son Yoshihisa, namely the Hosokawa and Yamana clans, who can be seen as the main instigators for the conflict. Eventually, conflict would erupt in the capital that would soon spread all across Japan. This was the Onin War, and it would kick off the nearly 150-year-long period of the Sengoku Jidai, Japan's iconic age of warring states. The weak grip of the Ashikaga shoguns, which had allowed for the growth of local lord autonomy all across the country, had paved the way for clans from all corners of Japan to set out to expand their territory and compete for regional dominance. As for the Onin War, Officially, it would end in 1477, and it would be Yoshimasa's son, Yoshihisa, who truly won out. But in the end, that really didn't matter. The damage had already been done, and now Japan was spiraling out of control into a state of bitter chaos. From this point on, we see shogunal politics in Kyoto largely influenced by the powerful clans that surrounded the capital. Clans such as, once again, the Hosokawa, but also later the Miyoshi and even Rokaku, those that had invested stakes and claims within the imperial city. But even clans as far away as the Ochi would have a hand in meddling with shogunal affairs, leading armies all the way from the west to champion the shogunate. And all throughout everything, the Ashikaga shoguns were actually pretty complacent to sit quietly while the wars raged on. However, by 1445, we see the rise of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru, who throughout his reign sought to expel the outside influence from the capital and perhaps solidify the Ashikaga as an independent force. One problem with that, however, was that, being that the Ashikaga had a small amount of core territory, they had to rely on the military aid of other clans to help them. To this extent, Yoshiteru, aided by the Rokaku, would seek to expel the Miyoshi from Kyoto. Although, in the end, they would be unsuccessful, and the city would remain under Miyoshi influence until the death of daimyo Miyoshi Nagayoshi in 1564. It was then that Yoshiteru rose up again. Yet 1 year later, Miyoshi lords, along with the infamous Matsunaga Hisahide, would seek to crush Yoshiteru's rising autonomy. They would assault Yoshiteru's residence and ultimately cause Yoshiteru to commit seppuku. After which, another Ashikaga puppet shogun would be installed. Several years later, we see the introduction of Ashikaga Yoshiaki, Yoshiteru's younger brother, who had fled the capital and was on the hunt for a powerful clan to aid him in reclaiming the shogunate for himself by expelling those who would seek to dominate the capital. Eventually, through the aid of famous figures like Hosokawa Fujitaka and Akechi Mitsuhide, he would find a champion in the rising star of Oda Nobunaga, fresh off of his conquest of Mino province. After being approached by Yoshiaki, Nobunaga would take up his cause and use it as an excuse to march on Kyoto, seizing the city by 1568. Yoshiaki was soon installed as the new shogun, but unfortunately he would quickly find himself now a puppet to the Oda. Nobunaga sought to use his role as a champion of the shogunate to launch campaigns against all those who would oppose him, and eventually, by the early 1570s, Yoshiaki was desperate to break free from the shackles of the Oda, sending out calls for aid to all those powerful enough to challenge the might of Nobunaga. In particular, calls went out to the Mori and Takeda, and thus by 1573, the legendary Takeda Shingen answered the call and began a westward push towards Kyoto. Initially, Takeda armies found success in sweeping aside any resistance the Oda and their allies put forth, famously winning the Battle of Mikatagahara against the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu. But unfortunately for the Takeda, Shingen would suddenly pass away while on campaign, leading to a halt in their advance. But by this point, Nobunaga had come to realize that enough was enough when it came to Yoshiaki. Being that he was now working directly against the efforts of the Oda and realizing that he was now no longer needed around, Nobunaga expelled him from the capital and officially dismantled the Ashikaga shogunate, bringing an end to their 237-year-long period of rule. For a time, Yoshiaki still continued to maintain the facade that he was still the shogun, but it meant little to nothing. The age of the Ashikaga was at an end. However, although they had been removed from power, they would still carry on. Under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, members of the Ashikaga family were granted the Katsuregawa fief back in their ancestral homeland of Shimotsuke province. And from this, they would later change their family name from Ashikaga to Katsuregawa and would continue to rule this area throughout the Edo period during the reign of the Tokugawa shogunate, until later, during the Meiji Restoration, deciding to restore their old prestigious family name, being Ashikaga once again. And although the last of this line would sadly die in 1983 with the death of Ashikaga Atsuuji, others descending from Ashikaga bloodlines still live on to this day in Japan and continue to hold up the traditions of the Ashikaga. The Ashikaga are one of the oldest samurai families, having their origins all the way back in the Heian period and being descended from the Minamoto. And although they ruled Japan for over 2 centuries, their inevitable fall would not mean the end of their clan, as their descendants would live on to this very day, keeping alive the former glory of the Muromachi Bakufu, Japan's second shogunate. If you would like a say in which clan I cover next, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, where you will gain access to exclusive polls to determine the next clan history video. And of course, I want to give a huge thanks to this video's sponsor yet again, Surfshark. Please check out the links below for an amazing offer on your very own VPN. But with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.